Hello, and welcome to Part 3, Lecture Number 1 of the Marlborough Medieval Studies course. This time, we will go through the whole chronology for the third and final time from late Rome through the end of the medieval period, sometime in the late 15th century, and we will be taking a look at it from the point of view of economy and daily life. I think of economy in this instance as including things like agriculture and production of goods, movement of goods, level of people's livelihood, things that they consumed and used. So daily life is the more general concept, and economy is perhaps the most common modern way of thinking about what that looks like and how systems like that function, but that's not the only way to look at it. So today we will be looking at late Rome, and we will go back over the crisis of the Roman state that we talked about in the first lecture, the very first lecture. This is going all the way back to the beginning. If you recall, one of the main questions from that lecture is that in 100 AD, you can see on the map here, Rome owns everything in the Mediterranean, much of England, all the way up to the walls that they build on the border between England and Scotland. Their only real competitor is the Persians to the east, and they have real political control of this huge amount of territory, really the largest that had ever been seen in that region. They thought of themselves as the greatest empire ever, and not without reason at the time. And between 100 and 400, they remain somewhat stable, although there are crises in the second century and crises in the third century in particular, particularly around leadership, succession of the Caesars, and they try to address those. But between 300 and 500, here's the map of 500, right? The western half of the empire in particular disintegrates. And part of the question is this a fall? Is this a catastrophe? Is this a long, slow change? Does this not represent a lot of change? And one of the changes that we see is political, another one is religious. Now we're going to talk about some of the economic changes and whether or not the economy of the time period would be viewed as something like a collapse, a catastrophe, or a broader change. So to answer that, let's first talk a little bit about what the Roman economy itself looked like. Now, the Roman economy is centrally controlled, and this is really important. There's two pieces to the Roman economy. There's the centrally controlled, all converging on the city of Rome, not entirely the city of Rome, but largely the city of Rome, city of Constantinople, a few other major cities that control large portions of long-distance trade, large portions of the production of the empire, and really a lot of the economic life that is going on. Now, beyond that, there are also rural productions, areas that are beyond the scope of city-centered economy. We often know a little bit less what those areas look like and what they're doing. And part of that has to do with where documents get drawn up. We know a great deal about Rome because they're writing all of the documents, and correspondingly Constantinople as well. Now, this centralized economy converging on larger cities involves a lot of the elements that we still have remaining from the Roman Empire itself. The grain supplies of the major cities involved a huge amount of infrastructure. Again, centrally controlled, but buildings and ships and roads. And one of the most famous parts about Rome is their road building. And here you can see three different roads: the Appian Way itself in Italy, the Marble Port Road in Turkey, and a Roman road in Great Britain in what is now Wales. Now, there's some debate as to whether the roads themselves were for commerce or for military purposes. And it's possible that this depended on where you are. The roads in England are notoriously dead straight ahead, just going over any sort of landscape. And they make no deviations for forests or hills. It's kind of strange, actually. In Italy, they're a little broader. As you can see, the Appian Way was a mix of cobblestone and pave. Ones like this one in Ephesus that are these broad marble paths that are very smooth probably did have goods that were carried along them. And there's some places in the mountains where they really just become single tracks. So, part of this might have been used for moving military around, but in larger places, It could also have been used for commerce, and certainly the larger roads between places like Ostia and Rome were used for the transport of goods. Now, Ostia is another good example of this sort of large infrastructure used in the economy. You can see here, these are fishmongers' shops from the port of Ostia. Ostia is the nearest port on the Mediterranean to Rome, and it tended to be the focus of all of the materials that came in that were then shipped to the city for the supply of Rome itself. And you can see this is a fishmonger's shop area. The Romans were very big fans of this pickled fish. I mean, it's really a sauce, but it's kind of a slurry. They would take different kinds of fish and fish guts and salt them and pack them in these giant ceramic containers that were partially buried and in cellars, and they would let it ferment like that. Really, it's not unlike num blah that they use in Thai food today, right? Thai fish sauce. Anyway, they loved this stuff, and that's one of the things that was packaged and made and shipped here in this place that we're looking at in Ostia, that was then sent up to Rome afterwards. Now, of course, the most important thing that was shipped in was bread. And you can see here, this is one of the giant granaries in Ostia, where they would get grain shipped from North Africa, Tunisia, parts of Libya, Algeria. Sicily was a huge grain producer. Sicily actually will remain a huge grain producer for 1,000 years after this. But all of the grain is systematically produced in these outlying areas and then shipped into the city of Rome as a consumer. And this is really important because this is part of the nature of the command economy, is that you have a big centralized producer that can demand that a lot of products be grown and produced in a variety of different places. So one of the things that you see near the end of Rome is as Rome itself begins to shrink and doesn't command as many resources as it did earlier and doesn't have as much political power to do so, that actually causes all sorts of economic chaos in the provinces that previously relied entirely on Rome for their income. It's you get a little bit of this in the modern economy with wealthier countries consuming things that are produced in foreign countries, and the popularity and whim of products on, say, the American or European markets can have influences on countries that produce those things that have nothing to do with those other economies. So the nature of the high Roman demand influences how things get grown in the provinces. Now, after everything gets shipped to Ostia, it's then transferred to places that look like this. And this is the markets of Trajan, these huge inner city planned out markets, right? And this is part of the other facet of this. Not only does it command a lot of resources, but everything is very structured by the government. It is all planned out in advance, and the imperial government makes most of the decisions of the sorts of products that are available, what the markets are going to look like. These are all publicly built buildings. Now, of course, this is an imperial government, so it's not as if it's built by the people, but it's built with taxation and in a centralized way. Now, one of the questions that this centralized market brings up is, what does trade penetration look like? Because despite the fact that you have huge amounts of products going to Rome and you have a fairly extensive long-distance trade across the entirety of the Mediterranean, really from one end to the other, the agriculture and the way people live in the provinces, the daily life, if you will, of most of the Roman citizens was really diverse and really varied based on the region you were in. Agriculture in North Africa looks very different than agriculture does in central France, which looks very different than agriculture does in northern England. And all of those are places that are connected to a greater or lesser degree to this Roman economy. Now, the Mediterranean itself is uniform enough that they grow olives and grain and grapes in all parts of it. But there are still parts, and this is still true today, that specialize in one or the other of those things. Southern Spain has always specialized in production of oil. That was true in Roman times. It continues to be true today. That's also true to some extent of Central North Africa, although in the Roman period, North Africa produced a lot of grain and shipped a lot of grain into Italy, and that's not something that you see continued. But despite that, your connection to the market would vary a lot based on what you were growing. Because if you were a subsistence producer, you're still not going to produce just grain or just olive oil or, say, just garum fish sauce for sale at Rome that would then produce most of the income that you needed to survive. If you were less connected to this, you would have a much more varied set of items that you would grow. You would have a very different lifestyle than somebody who is producing for a large, even if distant market. So that's one of the questions that it can be very hard to parse out depending on where you are in the empire. What is your connection to this, and how does that influence what you have access to on a daily basis? And the same thing that is true in Rome is also true in Constantinople. Constantinople's market extends south into Egypt, which produces a lot of grain for Constantinople, the area around the Black Sea, the northern part of the Black Sea. The northern part of the Black Sea in particular will continue to be a grain exporting area. It actually becomes important for the Italian city-states later on. Now, within this large centralized economy, you obviously have a lot of coin and a lot of trade in cash. You can't get materials made in Rome that you are going to trade directly to North African producers for what they are making, or those that are purchasing things in Constantinople from Egypt. So those all involve a sort of commerce, an exchange of monetary goods rather than exchange in kind. And this is one of the crises that you see that defines this. And again, whether you want to see it as a fall, a catastrophe, something does change between 200 and 500, and how radically depends on how we want to answer these questions. So one of the things that changes is the monetary economy really shrinks. Starting in the middle of the 3rd century, they start to change how they pay the military, and they stop paying so much in money, which before the military had been entirely paid for by taxation. They raise cash, they pay the soldiers in cash, they use it how they want. They began paying them in kind, so they would pay them with goods of some form, grain, you might get garum. Certainly bread, salt would become staples of what they actually got paid. So instead of giving you cash that you then go acquire what you need to live and choose what you need to live, you are given some of the subsistence elements that it's just assumed you need. Now, this might seem like a bad deal, but there are ways in which it's a good deal. I'll come back to that in just a second. But first, I want to make sure, because one of the other things that happens in the 3rd century that causes this is the debasement of coinage. And just to make sure that we know what that means, because debasement, it's kind of an intuitive word, but it means a very specific thing in the context of coinage. When you mint a coin, it is some percent gold and some percent other metals, right? If it's 12 karat or 16 karat, you can tell those things by looking at the gold, pinching it. You can bite it, apparently, because the hardness goes up the more other types of metals there are in it. So what a government will do, because gold is valuable in and of itself, is that you want your coin to be worth more than the gold in it, right? It's a serious problem if the money that you are minting is worth more as the metal than as the money, because that means that it's more valuable for the person who has it to actually melt it down so that it's no longer money and just sell it as the metal. Ironically, this is now true of the American penny, but we don't have a big epidemic of this problem, in part because pennies aren't very worth very much, and copper isn't worth a whole lot either. So it would really take a lot of pennies. And obviously the paper that goes into making a dollar bill is worth a tiny fraction of the cost of the dollar bill itself. So for the Roman Empire, if you're minting silver and gold coins, you want those coins to be more valuable than the silver and gold in them. But if the government starts finding itself short of cash, one of the things that it will do is it will print the same coin worth the same amount, but use less gold and less silver. And in some sense, you get a bump to your income immediately, but this is also the sort of thing that can cause inflation, can cause lack of trust in the currency itself. And it also, by minting more money, that can cause inflation, so you get these fluctuations in what people think the money is worth. And big fluctuations in what money is worth is hugely damaging to an economy. You can look up what Brazil did to stabilize people's trust in their own economic system. It's kind of brilliant. It's a modern example of what just trust in a currency and no other economic changes can do. So you should look that up. It's really cool. Anyway, debasement, right? The adding of non-fine metals to the coin so that you get more, the government can mint more for the same amount of gold, tends to have economic disruptions as part of that, although it is often a short-term fix to budget shortfalls. Some people complain that that's essentially what the Fed is doing today to try to jumpstart our economy. It's probably a little more complicated than that, but they might have a point. At any rate, in the middle of the 3rd century, starting with Marcus Aurelius, the wars that they're fighting on the frontier begin to pressure the imperial government to come up with more cash. So they do start debasing currency fairly rapidly, and especially when you have emperors coming and going, as we talked about, debasement can really get out of hand very quickly because they're really interested in raising the army that they need right then just to stay in power. So there's no view to the long-term consequences of debasement. So what you get is exactly what I talked about. You get a mistrust of currency. By the end of the 3rd century, you're getting massive inflation. There is a huge distrust and removal of good money. So any gold coin that is still a fine gold coin gets hidden, and people stash it, and they don't want to spend it because they're not sure where the coinage is going to go in 5 years. So they think that if it's going to be worth less, they keep the good ones, banking on that good one being worth more in 5 years. But what that does is that takes all the good coin out of circulation, and you're left with the debased coinage. And so commerce and trade really grinds to a halt when you do that. It's a little bit like what happened in the freeze up of credit in 2007, 2008. A lot of people took money out of stocks and put it into government bonds or bought gold. That's a stable currency, but it doesn't do anything for trade. It doesn't keep the movement of the economy going. So in that regime, you can see why a soldier might say, actually, I would rather work for so much bread and so much salt and so much fish rather than money. Because if you're not sure what money is going to buy you to survive, maybe you'd better just get the stuff to survive, and then whatever money you get on top of that, you can use for what you want. So that's actually one of the main reasons why the soldiers themselves begin to prefer that. You also see the extension of this is in the 4th and 5th century. In the barbarian invasions, they will start to offer them land, right? They offer them the ability to create the subsistence of life rather than any money at all. So they're removing money progressively from the system of the military. Now, another influence of this debased currency is the fact that the cities themselves start to decline in this time period. As I said, it's required to have cash exchanges or at least some form of credit or monetary exchange in order to get goods across long distances. And not only does the buying power of the cities start to decline in the 3rd century, but the elites themselves, who previously would have large houses or palaces in the city and purchase all of their luxury items there, they begin to move back to the country. This is exacerbated by the fact that payments in kind are becoming more valuable. Those are the ways that you buy things. So if you live in the country on your estate where you are producing goods, the land has a more stable value than the currency. So this encourages the elites to move out of the city. It reduces their buying power. It tends to start to deteriorate or even gut the city's center and economic center. So all of this is going on through the 3rd century, but it's actually something that we will see in many ways continuing all the way through to the 10th century. Now, if you remember this guy, Diocletian, he notices some of these problems and actually goes through some efforts to reverse them. Most notably, what he does is he issues a new coinage. He says, all right, everybody knows that the previous coin is debased, and I say, remember the cabbages. This is a guy who goes off to farm cabbages after he ceases to be emperor. he's pragmatic about this. So he does not debase the coinage. He issues two new coins, a new silver and a new gold coin, with 5.2 grams of gold and smaller denominations of pure silver. There were previous coins in the 3rd century issued by some emperors that were silver coins that had less than 10%, as little as 2% in some instances of actual silver in them. So very untrustworthy coins. He fixes the amount of gold and silver that go into the coins. This is not actually successful like the political reforms. Part of the reason for that is that there continues to be a need for huge amounts of copper coins. People have been using really low-end copper coins because at least they're a little more stable. But the issuing of all of these new coins doesn't really prevent inflation because he's trying to increase trust. He's doing exactly what the Brazilian government did that I mentioned earlier, that you should go look up. But by still minting a lot of money really rapidly, he's also contributing to another form of inflation. So the stability of prices doesn't end up happening, which is his main goal. The coinage stabilizes to some extent, but the prices of goods do not. And if the prices of goods are also in flux, then people are still going to prefer the goods to the money, which is part of the reason that the elites are leaving the cities. It's one of the difficulties in the military. He's not entirely able to fix that. So 8 years after he mints these two new coins, he attempts to just fix prices. Everything from beverages and shoes, wheat, luxury products. He fixes the wages for all sorts of jobs of manual labor and carrying things. And this doesn't work. We know this from 20th century economies. You don't have to be a particularly pro-capitalist person to recognize that government fixed prices across the board don't work. It tends to just produce black markets. In this case, not only were there probably black markets, but there were also hoarders. People started keeping the goods because they weren't sure what the value would be, what the government would say the value was. They could probably find a black market for it. There were riots as people in particular started to hoard foodstuffs. And all of this just demonstrates the fundamental weakness of the economy in the late 3rd and early 4th century. People also hoarded the new coins because as they're worried about inflation, they know that the coins are valuable and at least have a certain amount of gold in them. And if inflation really gets out of hand, if you need so many coins, at a certain point, the inflation of the cost of metals will make the metal in the coin more valuable. So people start hoarding the coins thinking that they might just melt them down at some future point. So with those effects, it really points out the impossibility of centralized economic control of this sort. It didn't work for Diocletian to fix the prices of goods. Stabilizing coinage is really the better way to go initially, but that didn't stem inflation quickly enough. So another thing that he does that is slightly more successful is he changes the way the taxes are collected. It used to be a lot of tax farming where the emperor would say, okay, well, I need so much money from this province, so I'm going to pay somebody to go get it. And that person gets paid by keeping a percentage of the taxes. It's a notoriously corrupt way to tax citizenry. And so he implements a straight head tax where every individual has a tax that they need to pay just by virtue of being a member of the empire. And this does do away with some of the corruption in the system, but again, he can't fix the inflation simply by fixing prices. And so that continues to be a difficulty for the Roman economy. Now, Constantine, as we talked about, in the political struggle in some sense, although Constantine returns it to the imperial government, it is a return to more stable rulership, right? Diocletian himself represents that, and as I said, his political reforms are, well, short-lived. His work on corruption and other things of that nature do have some positive effects. Now, one of the things that Constantine does that has some stabilizing effect on prices is to restore the taxation of the two halves of the empire to their own half. Previously, all taxes were collected, they were sent to Rome, and then they were paid back to certain cities. The West has a low population, but a really high level of militarization along its frontier because of the tribes to the north and a lot of the wars going on. So it tends to be a very expensive area, but it doesn't have a lot of people to support the military. So people in the East, both elites and more common people, had long been really frustrated that all of this money would go to Rome and it would then be sent to the sort of the border along the Danube and the Rhine, where there would be large military garrisons. So the money was just getting siphoned off of the relatively wealthier East in Constantinople, along the Middle East in what is now Syria, Lebanon, Israel. There were a fair number of well-to-do towns like Aleppo that were really reasonably well-off trading centers. And so their money was getting siphoned off to fight these, by their perspective, very, very distant wars. So when Constantine restores this split in taxation, the Eastern economy actually recovers a little bit at this point. The West continues to really crumble, and they rely more and more on payments in kind. As I mentioned, this is a point where it really accelerates, that they begin to offer certain barbarian tribes land in exchange for defending against other barbarian tribes. But the relative lack of invasions in the East, combined with this stronger economy, means that they actually begin to recover. So you can see an economic play out in some sense of what will become the Byzantine Empire, and also that sets up something like the rule of Justinian, where Justinian has a lot of clout and is ruling what looks like a stable Roman Empire still in the 6th century, although the West at that point has broken up into its small principalities, as we saw on the map at the beginning. Now, Constantine, like Diocletian, also mints new coins. Here's his coin, the gold solidus and the silver argentius. And both of these are more stable currencies, but as I said, they're more effective in the East than they are in the West. And so this leads to this very split economy in the same way that you see a split political realm. As the Germanic tribes enter into the Western Empire, the ruling families begin to take large pieces of land. They begin to act like the same elites of Rome that have been leaving the cities to go to the countryside to live in their rural estates. They have large amounts of land that are worked by a variety of people, some slave and some free, but the division between that is starting to blur. And we'll talk about that a lot in a couple of lectures on what those differences are. And in part because of the lack of a stable coinage, although, as I said, Constantine's coins are somewhat successful in the East, and you continue to get coinage minted in the Byzantine Empire, the Germanic tribes, as they take these large pieces of land, begin to rely more heavily on payments in kind. And that will set the stage for the way that medieval kingship and medieval empires are structured, how they deal with land, how they deal with taxation. And that's something that will become a staple of Western economic life for the next few hundred years. So we'll be talking about that in the next couple of lectures. Now, before I end, I just want to add one more piece of changes in material life. Now, here again is the map in 100 and the map in 400. And you see that there's not a lot of change going back and forth between 100 here. You see the entirety of the Mediterranean, the chunk of England. In 400 now we have this split between East and West, the appearance of some of the tribes. But by and large, the system is at least holding together and doesn't look like what it does in 500. So there may be a sort of tipping point. But I want to suggest one other facet that really does change. And that's represented best by this little chart here. Now, you can see that the grayed in area is the point in time when Rome controls really the entirety of the Mediterranean. These three different layers, it's a time when glaciers are retreating, so the climate is warming up. Tree ring growth tends to be a measure both of the length of summer, the availability of rain, but also good sun. Generally positive climates for growing quickly. So trees, when it's cold or when it's very cloudy, the ring is narrower because they don't grow as much in that year. So a wider tree ring means that you have better years. And this is giving you an average of the width of tree rings over those years. It's really cool. You can look at tree rings and you can actually do this over a couple of thousand years. The oldest trees are actually 4,000 years old. We don't actually even know how old they are because some of them are protected. You can't just cut them down and look at the rings. Although that's another crazy story. The Prometheus tree that was cut down, that is thousands of years old. That's another thing you can Google if you're interested in. And then the last one, the carbon-14, I have to admit, I'm not exactly clear on how this works scientifically, but basically what you're measuring is the level of carbon-14 which is an indicator of CO2 in the atmosphere. So it indicates something about the temperature, and as the amount of carbon-14 drops, it usually indicates a drop in temperature as well. And you can see around 500, 550, the glaciers themselves, whether glaciers are advancing or retreating tells you something about the long-term trend, but glaciers themselves move, well, really slowly. So they can sometimes continue to retreat after the weather has started to change. They're a much slower moving indicator than tree rings or carbon-14. But what you see here is that between 300 and 500, the weather in much of Rome starts to cool a little bit. And this can make a big difference, especially at northern latitudes if you're shortening the growing season by a week or two. We'll come back to this when we talk about what's called the medieval optimum, the medieval warm period around 1200, which you can actually see the little bump just after 1000 is sometimes called the medieval optimum. But like I said, we'll get back to that. So if the weather is cooling, this is going to encourage different sorts of settlement patterns. It's going to encourage people to live in slightly different areas. Hillland is not necessarily going to be as attractive if it's getting that much colder. If it's reducing your growing season by a few weeks, you may have to move to a lower altitude. It encourages different locations. If it's getting wetter, there may be more floods. You actually find in southern France a consolidation of where people live. There's less sporadic open settlement. And it's not clear if part of that is a political situation that encourages people to live together, or if rains tend to encourage you to build on top of a hill, so you get these little communities perched on top of hills as the lowlands flood more frequently with increased rain and cooler temperatures. Now, I offer this as supporting evidence. I don't want to suggest that I don't want to go the route of climatic determinism, because obviously stability of the economy, constant change in rulership, debasement of coinage, mistrust of the actual means of commerce and exchange are huge deals that really do matter. But when they coincide with what is still fundamentally an agrarian society, most people in the Roman Empire are still growing crops, even if those crops are fairly diverse. If you have barley in northern France, certainly barley in England, oats. Barley is grown some in the Mediterranean, but a variety of cereals across the empire. Wines and olives obviously are not being grown in England, although there's some wine that eventually in the medieval optimum you do get some wines in southern England, but you never get olives. It does simply remain too cold. But across this huge amount of land, most people are still farming and most people are still involved in the production of subsistence goods. So this sort of change can have a reasonably large impact on the daily lives of a lot of the empire. Now, the centralized economy that draws a lot of goods, that connects people into this system of exchange rather than simply subsistence farming, also has a large impact. And the crumbling of that puts more people back into subsistence. But subsistence is something that is being practiced by a lot of people throughout the time period. So climate also plays a role in how much we think this is a slow shift versus a catastrophe. And again, if we're thinking in climatic terms, that does argue for something like a slow shift, but it does also emphasize the fact that the economy is not as productive in 500 as it was in 200. And that without the centralized control, without centralized purchasing, without economic exchange, one scholar refers to this as a radical economic simplification. And certainly people's lives look very different in terms of what they have access to at the end of the Roman Empire as compared to the beginning. So next time, we will look at the early medieval economy, the way that land is used, and what this looks like in the Carolingian Empire, a very different empire than Rome, and one that looks much more like what we think of as medieval European economy. Now, there's still trade, there's still exchange going on, and we'll look at how and where, because some of the ways that happens are quite interesting. But we'll talk about that next time. Thank you.